You're kind of handling this committee and the issues the way that we are is that we want to make sure that we do this where individuals can see exactly what's going on. We want to be transparent. We want to give people opportunity to kind of vet the things that go on. So we are having this hearing today, give folk a few weeks to noodle on it, and then when we come back, we'll take some more decisive action, or at least that's the plan. So, Mr. Santana, do you want to start this off?
Certainly.
Or what I'm told, Andrew just came and said, since you're leaving, I should have Gene start, that I should just bump you. And so we're going to have, Gene start, and then we'll go to Sharon and Big Jim, and then we may eventually get to you.
Well,
now, how do you want
I'll
to
sign up for public comment.
So, but no, I think I do want Gene. What works best here? In fact, I'll let you guys kind of help us through this.
We can just give a brief overview of our CAO-CLA report, which is really, really brief because it's really about the attachments to our report. So with that said, we can start with Gene, if you wish.
No, we'll do, I'm going to, in fact, since you're here, you're going to be here, and you're going to, and you're going to be advising this council, Sharon. I'm going to defer to you. And so we will let you start this off however you see fit.
Thank you, Mr. Wesson. So the item before you is a CAO-CLA report that provides an update with regard to the LA 24 bid for the Olympics. The attachments to the report relate to the KPMG report, which reviews the budget of the LA 24 proposal. KPMG is here and available to make a presentation to you. I won't go into their findings except to say that they believe that the budget is a conservative budget, that it is complete and a realistic budget, and they can be here to report to you on the budget. Also attached is a state legislative analyst report to the legislature relative to SB 1465. This relates to the $250 million guarantee that the state has approved. It makes certain observations and provides guidance to the governor and the legislature in terms of what they should consider as they move forward on that guarantee. And the final piece of our report relates to an update on the MOU with LA 24, and we're available to discuss that further after you hear the presentations.
Okay. Miguel?
Ditto.
Okay. Gene, you want to start this off?
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you, Council President Wesson. We're proud to follow in the tradition of two previous Los Angeles Olympic Games, which were both extremely successful financially. While other Olympic cities have incurred significant construction costs by building new stadiums, infrastructure, or Olympic villages, Los Angeles is different. Our city already has the world-class existing stadiums, new infrastructure, and a modern Olympic village at UCLA, allowing us to create a plan for the Games with minimal construction budget and minimal risk. Our budget is based on the same advantages that made the previous two LA Games financially successful: minimal construction costs using our city's existing venues, and this is very important, the lucrative commercial opportunities available with our large local, state, and national economies. In developing our budget, our team conducted budget workshops with the CAO, the CLA, and the city attorney's offices over a 6-month period to ensure a collaborative partnership. And I must say it's been very collaborative, and we appreciate the help that we've had. This means that our process was both rigorous and realistic, and its foundation is conservative to minimize risk for all stakeholders. The easiest way to express our budgetary objective to both the City of Los Angeles and the IOC is in 2 words: no surprises. If LA is chosen to host the 2024 Games, we are removing the worry about changing or evolving budgets, shifting competition venues, or uncertainty concerning the delivery of the games. With Measure R and now Measure M, and with a near total overhaul of LAX, LA 2024 is a beneficiary of our city's ongoing investments in the future. By using the city's wealth of existing venues and UCLA's housing for the Olympic Village, we're paying rent rather than ever-changing construction costs. That means we can achieve precision and certainty in our plans, along with delivery of top sports environments with experienced venue operators. Our games plan offers stability and minimal risk. We've worked with third-party experts, including the Boston Consulting Group, the Broadstone Group, advisors from previous successful games such as London 2012 and Vancouver 2010, and our games master planning partner, AECOM, to develop the games plan. AECOM, by the way, is a Los Angeles-based company. And finally, after all that work, as you will hear, we opened our doors and our books to KPMG and their team, which spent 5 weeks in our office where they independently reviewed our budget. We hope you will take comfort from their report and remarks today that the LA 2024 plan is in place, the venues are in place, and all is accounted for and budgeted for to avoid any surprises. Our budget is based on a bottoms-up approach. This method helps ensure that we've examined every source of revenue and every cost, not only in the context of historical precedent, but also as they relate to our games plan. Our revenue and cost models have been tested and validated with external Olympic Games experts and professional financial consultants. And then we finally have worked with the IOC, the international sports federations, and other Olympic and Paralympic stakeholders who provided us advice as well. So to go to the budget is a balanced budget which shows $5.3 billion of revenue and cost, including a significant contingency of almost $500 million. The budget is conservative, realistic, and achievable. In terms of revenue projections, we've reviewed marketing data from previous Olympic Games, validated our assumptions with the IOC, and incorporated input from Olympic sponsorship experts, including the US OC marketing team, and conducted a careful analysis of the unique nature of the United States and Southern California sports marketplaces. There are 5 distinct sources of revenue in our operating plan: the IOC's contribution, domestic sponsorship, ticket sales, licensed merchandise, and other revenues. The IOC will contribute $1.3 billion in funds, or almost 25% of the total revenue. $855 million of that comes from our share of the IOC's global broadcast rights with partners like NBC, and $454 million comes from the IOC's top global sponsorship program with companies like McDonald's and Coca-Cola and Samsung. Domestic sponsorship is the largest component of our revenue projections, totaling $1.93 billion, or 36% of our total. We are projecting $1.47 billion in ticket sales, which is almost 28% of the total. We project 8.4 million tickets to be sold to Olympic events and 3.3 million tickets sold for Paralympic events. Licensing and merchandising make up 4% of our total at $225 million. And finally, we have $368 million, or a little less than 7%, projected in a line called Other Revenues, which is comprised of items such as food and beverage commissions and donations. Now, to turn to costs, our largest expense is venue infrastructure at $1.19 billion, almost 23% of the total. This figure includes no new permanent construction. It does include temporary venues and the overlay and fit-out of existing sports venues to Olympic Games specifications, such as installing a temporary track at the Coliseum. Sports, game services, and operations at $922 million makes up just over 17% of costs. That includes a myriad of items necessary for the Games, ranging from accommodation to food and beverage to transport and even test events before the Games. As we know, the Olympic and Paralympic Games are very technology dependent, and to that end, we've budgeted $565 million, a little less than 11% of our budget, for technology. As noted, we've been extremely conservative in our approach. Therefore, we've also included a contingency of $491 million, 10% of our expenditure budget. It is important to emphasize that the budget we're submitting to the city today is an output of our games concept. In other words, we've created the best possible plan for the Olympic movement and for the city and the people of Los Angeles, and the budget reflects the plan. The result is an LA 2024 Games concept that is extraordinary in its presentation and delivery of the Games, a prudent and responsible use of our city's existing resources and assets, and one that offers stability and minimizes risk to Los Angeles, to the IOC, and to the Olympic movement, not just for 2024, but many years beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, before we get into question and answers, I didn't have your card earlier, but we have I think a very special supporter that's with us today, trying to assist you guys and all of us in bringing the games to the greatest city on the planet, and that's Miss Candace Cable is here. And I have a card that maybe you say a few words. It's, you know, I was handed a note that all of the medals that you won, my staff guy says I couldn't even carry them there. So I think it's 12 or better, and the first American female to medal in the Paralympics Games. And you're from this area, I'm told. So anyway, I'm Herb, this is Paul, this is Joe or Steve, that's Bob, and that's Kern. No, he's Joe. And it's such a pleasure to meet you. So we thought we'd let you chat, and then we will grill Gene. Okay. Welcome.
Oh, well, don't be too hard on him. This is a huge opportunity, and thank you so much for. I'm overwhelmed right now by being brought forward because I was going to make public comment, and I was really excited by that. Thank you so much. You know, I've never been in this building before.
It's gorgeous, isn't it?
It's amazing, and I was telling Manov when he brought me in, I have to go on a public tour because I want to see the whole building. It's so beautiful. Thank you so much for bringing me forward.
Thank you.
So I wanted to say, I grew up in West Covina in the early 1950s, and my father had one of the roofing companies that was one of the third largest roofing companies in Southern California in the 1960s. And I loved growing up in Southern California, and I was a non-disabled child. I didn't have a disability then, and I had every opportunity. And in 1975, I had a spinal cord injury, and that resulted in me being able to use a wheelchair, woohoo, which was really challenging in the very beginning, because in 1975, there were no opportunities or access for anyone with any type of disability. And I thought my life was over, that I would spend the rest of my life in an institution, which you can only imagine would be really devastating. And then I got a lot of counseling, and I went forward and started at the university in Southern California here at Long Beach State. And I met some people that were creating opportunities with adaptive sport. I was not an athlete before my injury. So it's a true testament that people can change, right? But I wanted to hang out with them. I wanted to understand how they dealt with their disabilities and how I could move forward. And I got involved with adaptive sport, and it literally saved my life and changed my life. And I became a very successful Paralympic athlete in both summer and winter sport. The Paralympic Games have an opportunity to create social change on such a massive scale that you can't even imagine. It happens by osmosis when the Paralympic Games come to a city. I've seen it happen over and over. I've attended 13 Paralympic Games, 9 as an athlete, 1 working for the U.S. Olympic Committee as an athlete services coordinator, with, I have to say, it was probably one of the most important experiences in my life, because it really showed me about service and being able to be there for the athletes and making sure the athletes have the best possible experience, which is something that I know we can do here if the games are given to us and we have the honor of hosting them. And then I covered the games. And when I covered the games, I got to see how the games were put on and back of the house, and also what happened in the community. And I know from personal experience that the Paralympic Games create an opportunity for everyone to feel like they're involved in the games. The Olympic Games are really exciting, and we see amazing performances, but oftentimes people don't feel like they can relate to that performance. But during the Paralympic Games, people feel connected to the athletes, and it inspires them to be bigger and better than they ever thought they could be. And it also creates an opportunity for social impact above and beyond anything that we could ever imagine. And it happens every time. I mean, we even saw it in Rio, you know, a city that was really behind the ball there, trying to get it together. And they admitted they wait till the last minute to do everything, of which we would not here. And we don't have to, because we don't have to build anything. That's the exciting thing, is we don't have to do that. And they even had social change happen for them. So I'm going to say this is a huge opportunity for all of us. And I am honored and blessed to be able to be a part of this group, being on the board and now working in the office, to be able to just bring the presence of disability forward, because it's important for us all to understand that disability is just a life experience, right? It's going to happen to all of us because we're aging, right? And so we have to get on board to create access for everyone. And I think the Paralympic Games, no, I have to change it. I know the Paralympic Games can change that feeling that those people need access to, we all need access. And I think it's a really powerful experience. And above and beyond, the sports performances are going to blow your mind, totally. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak. I know I went way past my 1 minute.
No, well, you were part of this presentation, okay?
Oh, thank you.
So you were part of this presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And I do want to take a moment. I had introduced you to the members of the committee. We've had 2 members just come in. To my right is Mr. Mitch O'Farrell. This is Candace.
Nice to
To
meet
my
you.
left is the vice chair of this committee, Gilbert Cedillo.
Thank
And-
you.
and,
Nice to meet you.
Thank you for coming and chatting with us. It was very inspirational.
And if there is anything that I can help with, please let me know. Please contact me. I would love to spend time with any of you if you have any questions at all.
See,
And,
that's a mistake when you say that to us.
well, I could even bring a medal in, gold medal.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to meet you. Okay. Who did we lose? Okay. All right, Gene, and if you could just, I know you wrapped up, but why don't you end it again and then we'll start.
Okay.
So you left us with,
I left you with the conclusion of our budget. I'll just repeat that this budget that we presented to the city today is a result of our games concept. As I said, it's an extraordinary presentation of the games, prudent and responsible use of our city's existing resources and assets, one that offers stability and minimizes risk to Los Angeles, the IOC, and to the Olympic movement. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
well, look, we want to thank you again for the hard work, and Candace, thank you for that surprise for you to come in and we get a chance to meet you. So I do want to ask a question, or do we want to go back to?
We also have KPMG here, who's
Oh, yes. Okay, but before, and I guess this kind of slides into what you're going to say, or I would think. when we first announced that we were going to go after these games, and we quickly, or when we knew that Boston was out and that we were going to aggressively, compete ourselves, and we put together a projected budget, what we thought it might cost, and there were a lot of suggestions that we just kind of pulled figures out of the air, and so where it relates to these current numbers, how can we articulate this to the public and the media where there's credibility and integrity in the numbers that the budget that you just gave us? What's different now than then? And
I think the budget you're referring to was actually a budget prepared in 2014 when the U.S. Olympic Committee ran a competitive process between Los Angeles, Boston, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. That was a very preliminary budget. It did not reflect, for example, any negotiation, any direct involvement with any of the venue partners. And it had no idea that UCLA, for example, was going to be the Olympic Village. So literally everything that is in this budget has been built up from the ground up since that time. And we didn't start until after we were selected by the USOC. So there's a couple of years of separation and an entirely new and fresh process. The budget that was sort of a conceptual budget in 2014 was a good piece of work, but it was work done by a small team to submit to the U.S. Olympic Committee. This is a formal budget, one that involves all of the real work that goes into a formal budgeting process, a partnership with all of the city departments and, in fact, everybody that we can think of who would make the budget stronger and have greater integrity. And then finally, it's been independently reviewed by KPMG at the request of the city with full cooperation and collaboration from us. So I do want to emphasize that very preliminary budgetary concept in 2014 and the budget that we're presenting to you today are completely different. And therefore, this budget really has a significant amount of direct integrity on its own.
Well, thank you for that answer, because I wanted to highlight that, because I wanted to draw that comparison, and I want to make sure that people know, how we actually got to this point. We got dinged up a little bit where related to the preliminary budget, and I get that, and things like that happen, but this is a lot of work has gone into this, and I wanted you to be able to articulate that. And now what I want to do is dot the I and cross the T by asking you if you could identify yourself, and we thank you for coming and help give us your assessment.
Of course. Thank you and good morning. I'm Dee Dee Owens. I'm a partner with KPMG, and I led our assessment of the budget. So we did a deep dive into both the revenue and expense categories of the budget. To do that, we brought specialists in Olympic Games, infrastructure costs, a variety of different things to meet with LA24 for those 5 weeks that Jean mentioned. In addition to looking at the numbers, we also looked at the basis of the conservative approach, the bottom-up approach, to make sure there were models and numbers that supported those budget estimates. So we really did a deep dive into all of those materials. Overall, our conclusion is that the budget is reasonable, it is conservative, and it is complete. We know that LA24, our work found that you brought specialists to do each of those different categories in the budget. We met with them repeatedly. We had no significant findings in relation to our budget. We additionally noted that the level of detail behind the budget, our game specialists felt was substantially ahead of what we would have expected for this stage in the bid process. So I know I echo the comments that you made from an independent perspective.
Okay.
I think what was said is absolutely correct. When we were asked to review the initial budget concept, as Jean called, it was exactly that. It was a concept. There were ideas about where venues could be located, but there were no specifics behind it. I think you couldn't find a document that's more opposite from what we had seen before. It has a tremendous amount of detail. It's conservative in its approach in terms of revenues, and it's actually very comprehensive in terms of expenditures. And the most important part, I think, is that it also helps inform how we will continue to partner with LA24, should the city be selected for the games, to ensure that we have ways to evaluate new information that surfaces on an ongoing basis. If the city were to be selected to host the games, obviously the budget, much like the city's budget, will be a fluid document. There'll be new information about cost, there'll be new information about revenue. It is our recommendation that the council and the mayor continue to be part of that process in the same way that you review the city's budget, and so that when the games actually take place, there are no surprises, as Gene has established as sort of being the foundation of how all of this is being done. This budget allows us to do that in a way that is predictable. We have sort of specific areas in which into the future the city will evaluate and ask questions from. So it's a good framework as we move forward, should we be fortunate enough to actually host the games.
Sharon?
I don't have anything further to add other than to say that KPMG did also indicate that what's going to be really important on a go-forward basis is the ongoing oversight component, to make sure that we adhere to this budget, to ensure that we limit our financial liabilities on a go-forward basis. And one other point relative to the conservativeness of the budget, one of their findings also talked about the contingency line item. Gene indicated that it's almost 10%, but in addition to that, there are contingencies and other line items of the budget which provide an additional cushion to prevent some of those financial liabilities that could occur.
Okay, Big Jim, did you want to weigh in at all at this point?
Only that I agree with what has been said at the table by everybody. And I do want to add that not only did LA24 work very closely with KPMG, so did the city family, especially our three departments. And we had meetings, several drafts of the reports. So it was an interactive process, and our departments were involved in it as well. Not to the extent that LA24 was, but significantly.
Okay, now did the state analysts look, did they do an analysis of this, the state?
Yes, they did.
And so, did you guys review the work that was done in the state, and how did that compare with your findings? Because I'm assuming that somewhere in the state that they looked at this before they decided to do whatever they did. And I mean, was there, were any differences or?
So the state LAO was actually prepared a report in response to the SB 1465. And basically what they did was they did an overview of the entire Olympic process. They talked about prior Olympics. They reviewed what was done in the past with regard to the state. And primarily their interest was to provide some guidance to the legislature and governor to protect the state's interests. And they also recognize the city's work in reviewing the budgets to ensure that we are limiting financial liabilities as much as possible. So they do recognize the vigorous effort that we have been going through here. But with that said, to protect their interests and to ensure that they limit their financial liabilities, they provide some observations to the governor as he negotiates on a go-forward basis the contract with the city and LA24 on how to provide that $250 million guarantee. So recall
Even
that,
though our goal is to never get there.
Exactly, and that is our goal. But the legislature does recognize that they want to limit their exposure, so they also indicate that the legislature should stand firm, that the legislature might also want to consider forming some oversight committees to also do similar monitoring of what's happening with the budget in the event that LA is selected as the 2024 Olympic site. So they make a number of observations, but they also recognize that it is a lower risk because of the need of not building infrastructure, that there is no Olympic Village that's being constructed, so they do recognize that this particular bid is a lower risk bid.
Okay. Well, before we go into, I would imagine, a conversation about where we are with the MOU, why don't I open it up to members for questions at this point? Mr. Buscaino?
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you for your presentation. It's an incredible budget that we have before us moving forward to land the games here in Los Angeles. There's recent talks of potentially the IOC awarding 2 bid cities for 2024 and 2028. How real is that? What's the insight on that? And if so, are we prepared if indeed we land either 2024 or 2028? What's before us? What would be the next steps if indeed we land one of the 2 games, either 24 or 28?
So you're right, there has been some media speculation, and I think that President Bach even responded to some questions after an executive board meeting this week for the IOC membership. And the answer is we don't know anything about what they intend to do. They have not spoken to us about this directly, so we have no insight, and I would just make sure that I'm very, very clear. We're bidding for 24. The presentation here, the budget here, all of our work is aimed at 24. We have given no consideration to 28 at this point. I don't want there to be any confusion.
That's the spirit. I appreciate that, Gene. And as far as, an impressive over $5 billion in revenue is projected, is that my understanding? When was the last time any game brought in over $5 billion in revenue?
Well, the London Games were not far from that. We're projecting more sponsorship revenue than the London Games had. But London is in a country that's less than 60 million people in the United Kingdom. And the United States is significantly larger and has much more commercial potential. So the biggest difference in revenues between our bid budget and the London experience in 2012 is our projection of sponsorship revenue domestically. Now, at the same time, some of the IOC contributions have grown as they have negotiated higher fee payments from both the broadcasters.
We've been trying to kill that damn fly for hours. So.
I thought you sent that after me, but that's okay. The broadcasters and the sponsors who pay the IOC have paid them more, so that share from the IOC has gone up a little bit. And then just inflation and the number of tickets will lead to ticket revenue. But our budget is actually a budget that has a lot of similarity to what London experienced. London is the closest Summer Olympic Games to what we would anticipate we would do.
Understood. And as far as, comment or question to KPMG is, I didn't see anything in the budget as far as addressing some of the city services as it relates to trash and traffic and public safety here that the city of LA would have to absorb.
So we did look at the municipal services budget that was embedded in the LA 24 budget that we reviewed, and we felt that the number set aside for those types of services was reasonable. So we did dive into the rationale and assumptions behind those numbers and the benchmarks associated with those numbers. So it was part of our assessment.
So it isn't included. Appreciate that.
They have seen all of the detail that goes into each of those items in great detail. So we actually have budgeted for that, and it's quite substantial. The line items that we're reflecting in the public budget submission have been summarized so that we don't have all the detail underneath it.
Thank you for that clarification. As far as estimating the potential ripple effect of a local economy, why didn't we look at, looking at the revenue supporting LA businesses, both small and big? And I strongly feel that our hotels and our restaurants, and especially in and around the venues, taxis, ride sharing, list goes on, should be a major focus of these types of conversations moving forward, because it's going to be an incredible economic impact to our local economy. So why was that not included?
Mr. Buscaino, that is certainly part of the plan as we move forward at the next stage, is to do an analysis of the economic benefits to Los Angeles and to the broader region, and I know that's something that LA 24 will also be doing.
Wonderful.
Right. We're already beginning that process with an outside party, but that is not included in this budget report.
So we expect to see that next go around,
Yes.
next phase. And lastly, if I can, Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
how does this budget compare to when we hosted the Olympics back in 1984?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer at my fingertips, but I'll be happy to do the research and come back to you.
Right, thank you.
Okay, members, any other? Mr. Blumenfield?
Thank you. Especially after hearing the inspiring message from Candace, I wanted to ask a little bit about what we're going to do to improve the coverage of the Paralympic Games and how we're going to move forward on that.
It's an excellent question. I will tell you that we're LA 24, and I believe the city of Los Angeles are committed to an extraordinary Paralympics experience, and we have really dug in. I believe it's safe to say that our team has done much more work than our competitors in understanding how the Paralympics works and engaging with the Paralympic movement in a way that I think establishes a tremendous amount of sincere credibility in this effort. A big part of it, maybe two pieces, are providing the right media coverage in advance of the games. And we've already spoken quite a bit with NBC about that. NBC has provided more coverage for each Paralympic experience every time they've gone around, but we need to do more with them, and they've told us they would definitely work in that direction. And then the second thing is finding sponsors who actually uniquely sponsor the Paralympics. This is something they did in London. They found one key sponsor who for 6 months before the games did advertising and promotion for the Paralympics so that the audience, the market, was well prepared for the Paralympic experience, and they did a tremendous job. So I think those are great things for us to learn from. We've spoken extensively with the London team that was responsible for that, and we would employ some of the same approaches with even greater emphasis given the size of our market.
Great. I just wanted to follow up on something I raised at the last meeting, and I know you guys were working on in terms of the trying to understand the state versus our city liability on their backstop, so to speak. In their document, it says if all other funding mechanisms have been exhausted, including insurance by OCOG, then at least $250 million of city funds. So when does the state kick in, and can we mitigate? If we insure against our $250 million, I kind of look at it as a deductible, but can we actually do that? At what point does the state give us credit for having exhausted all of our funds? Because in theory, that's not until we're bankrupt.
So if, as you suggest, if the city insures against the obligation to stand behind $250 million of costs, or if you will, loss, before the state's supplemental $250 million guarantee begins, then we would have to go through all of our contingency, all of our insurance at every level, and have the insurance, which is covering the $250 million loss, actually be fully utilized. So there would be a $250 million, if you will, call on that insurance before the state would actually put in their $250 on top of that. But I would emphasize the insurance provisions that we've anticipated and budgeted for have several layers before we ever get to that loss in the first place. So our expectation is there would be minimal risk of ever calling on even the 250, whether it's insured or not.
Yeah. Although you want to go through these worst case scenarios, obviously, to give everyone comfort, even though, like everyone here, I assume that's not going to happen. I just got worried by the way that's written in the LAO report. It says, including insurance purchased and at least $250 million of city funds. So to me, that sounded as if down the road, they're going to count the insurance and then basically have to bankrupt us for $250 million before they go to that next step. So I just like to see that as ironclad as it can be.
Any other questions? Mr. Krikorian.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I guess it's my job to be the guy who's the tightest with the buck. So I have a couple of questions on the budget. First, it seemed like, and let me just say at the outset how really heartened I am that there's kind of unanimity, including KPMG, about the conservative nature of this budget. That was exactly, I think, what we had all hoped to see. So thank you, Gene, to you and your team for taking the most conservative path that we could, because as Mr. Blumenfield just reminded us, we're not getting a lot of help from anywhere else. This state guarantee does not give me any comfort whatever. That's like catastrophic health insurance or something. It doesn't help us in meeting the needs that we're going to have to speak of. We're on the hook for this. So we need to be conservative in the budgeting. And the one area that KPMG kind of suggested was maybe not as conservative as it might have been was on the ticket sale revenue side. So I want to talk just a little bit about that. We used London, you used London as the assumption, as the basis for the assumption, and I'm just wondering, why we didn't apply sort of other cities' experiences in terms of ticket revenues. And obviously, there's elasticity in Olympic tickets, as there would be in any other kinds of tickets. So the assumption on the sale rate is one part of it, but then the pricing assumption has to be a part of that as well. And so I'm trying to understand how that dynamic works. We could get 100% ticket sales if we dropped the price enough, I assume. So how does that work? And maybe I'd ask KPMG that as well.
Sure, let me start. So the pricing embedded in the tickets is based on London. Now that's based on the observation that the market in London, sophisticated, very large metropolitan area in a developed economy, is more like Los Angeles than, for example, Rio or some other city where the Olympic Games have been hosted, Athens, for example. And it's relatively recent. So we're able to make a pretty close approximation based on 2012 relative to today. And then, of course, all the numbers that we build today in our model today will be inflated by a cost of living factor to 2024. So pricing on London seemed to us to be a reasonable thing to do. I think the other factor, and KPMG asked about this, is we made an assumption that we would sell 97% of the tickets that were available. And that, I think, is the area that raised a question, and you could use a different approach. You could say, would you sell 97% of everything, or would you sell 100% of the most exciting, attractive final events and maybe 80% of preliminary rounds of badminton or something? And so I think that's a reasonable question to ask, and I think their input was very constructive. And I might turn it to KPMG just to talk a bit about that.
Sure. So we looked at the ticketing model to basically understand how sports were aligned with venues to make sure the capacity was appropriate, so the net capacity was appropriate. We looked at how pricing was strategic pricing based on the popularity of sport and things like that. We go back to the 97% sell rate, which is London's sell rate, so it is something that has happened in the past, but it is the highest rate achieved for an Olympic game. We did a model, or a few models, to kind of understand the potential impact behind the 97% sell rate. And given that the majority of the revenue comes from a certain number of sports and basically the opening and closing ceremony, the impact, depending on whether or not the 97% is achieved versus our model, is about 0 to, I think, 30 million, maybe a little bit more than 30 million. So our point is 97% didn't adhere to the conservative approach, basically that the remaining aspects of the budget did adhere to. So our perspective would be is if this is something that people are confident in, having the marketing and the attention to that 97% as the budget continues to move forward and the games continue to move forward.
Okay, so I just did kind of some back of the envelope here. Under your more conservative assumptions, if those were applied to this budget, it would make a difference of about 35 million in ticket revenues, and then you assumed from that also a little bit less in food and beverage revenues, say call it 40 million. As I calculate it, that would be like 0.75% of the overall revenues, right? So that's well within any margin of error on this budget. That's well less than any contingency would be. So this is, even with the most conservative model that you've applied, it's kind of pennies in the big scheme of things.
Correct,
right?
Which is why we didn't categorize it as material, as significant.
Terrific. That's what I want to hear.
It's important to add that in the context of all the other revenues, particularly around domestic sponsorship and licensing and merchandising, which we're very conservative, there is additional potential cushion that exists to far exceed that small level of risk that exists in ticketing.
Yeah, and on the sponsorship issue, because Gene, you mentioned that's assumed to be significantly higher than in the past. Mr. Buscaino mentioned that as well as part of the revenues package. Just in layperson's terms, how come? I mean, I get that there's different models you can apply, but why do we expect that our Los Angeles Olympics will have substantially larger sponsorship opportunities than, say, someplace like London?
This line reflects the opportunity to sell domestic sponsorship in the host city's home country. The entire United Kingdom has 60 million people. The United States is the biggest commercial market in the world, 300 million people, incredibly well-developed sports interests, and by comparison, there is significantly greater opportunity in the United States. This would be the first time since 1996 in the Atlanta Games that the U.S. would be the host for the Olympic Games, and especially after we've developed a good insight into the nature of support and interest in the Olympic Games from people like the USOC and NBC. I might remind you that NBC sold more advertising for the Rio Games. That advertising came from domestic sponsors who sponsored their broadcasts in the United States than ever in the history of Olympic broadcasts in the past, far exceeding their own estimates. So when we consult with them and have access to their advice about how to build a budget and think about opportunity, it's very reassuring. I think actually our methodology is conservative relative to the size and scale of the U.S. market.
So were you able to compare that differential, say, with the Atlanta Games comparing to the Barcelona Games and the Sydney Games to see that there was a significantly greater sponsorship U.S. sponsorship opportunity there than there was in the preceding and following games?
Well, we've tracked everything that we could find where there was available data. In some cases, this data isn't available for every games, but in terms of the data from U.S. games, that data is available. It was included in our work.
Okay. Before I move on to the next area, Mr. President, I want to not monopolize if there's other
So why don't we'll get some of the other members and we'll circle back to you. But I guess I'll say, because Jim, I'm going to close the public comment at this time. So I'm looking at you as our attorney. So, we've been going for about an hour, so public comment is officially closed.
I think that's fine.
All right. I want to go to Mr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank, first of all, the team for the excellent presentation. It's good to know that our numbers are being scrubbed and re-scrubbed, and I feel confident that we are, as planned, going to have a profitable games. I was interested in the expenditure line for ceremonies and culture, and just curious, the description on page 17 suggests that the ceremonies, the closing opening ceremonies, the relay, the blah, 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 and it also references the cultural Olympiad. And to me, it looks like that's kind of where the outreach goes on, where the opportunity to really engage the community, probably in a variety of venues, would be. It suggests that the activities take place leading up to the games, also is an important part of supporting the games, educating the games, and getting local buy-in. So I'm just curious kind of what the breakdown is of that 176, which just happens to be the smallest amount on the budget. How much of that is ceremonies, and then how much is that for culture? Or other parts, other pots for culture that there could be opportunities again for directly engaging the community through a variety of events and activities that involves the community as a part of the preparation and participation in the Olympic Games.
Well, I don't have the detail in front of me. I'm looking at my team. The detail is certainly available. I'd be happy offline to take you through the detail that we have. I will tell you that the total for ceremonies was built up based on what we've seen in other games, including cultural Olympiad work. And this is also done in partnership with many cultural partners. So we've already announced a cultural partnership with the Getty, who is a great institution in the city and is very enthusiastic about using some of their experience. As you know, they've operated the Pacific Standard Time multi-institutional cultural experience. So some of that learning is something that we'll take advantage of, and we'll partner with them for parts of the Cultural Olympiad. But I think the opportunity is quite vast, so this is an area where we could see some expansion as well. In terms of the detail, I'll be happy to take you through that when I have it in front of me.
Yeah, we're just curious, and again, in terms of the money that we're allocating for that purpose, you know, I don't think that the community outreach efforts should be shortchanged, notwithstanding the importance of other expenditures. If there are partnerships, let's talk about those. I certainly appreciate the Getty, but you know, we want to see you know, a little more aggressive grassroots level of participation, and I'm sure it's there. I just want to know kind of how we're planning for it. And is this 176 pretty consistent then with London, since that's the model we are looking at apparently? Huh?
Yes, that's right. The numbers are a function of what we've seen in other precedent, and then gotten some advice from other people who've actually been responsible for doing these things. So the numbers reflect that input. In terms of community involvement, and I want to make sure I emphasize this, we actually have, from the beginning, that is last September, had a consistent approach of engaging with community organizations throughout the city. That's an ongoing effort, and we find it is a vast and, I think, open-ended process. And we've found incredible enthusiasm from community partners throughout the city. You know, one of our great community partners is, of course, LA 84, which is the foundation that was developed in the aftermath of the 84 games, and is itself a very significant grantor to other community organizations throughout the city that support kids' sports programs. They have been a fantastic partner of ours, and we've done a number of events with them, including the Olympic Day celebration, which was held at the Coliseum in June. So that's an example of the sorts of things that we're doing, but actually what I could do to help provide you more insight is just go through what is our community engagement strategy included so far. I think you'll be comforted and impressed, and of course we would love to have more input. If there are organizations that any of you believe are organizations that we should work with, collaborate with, receive input from, I think that's both our responsibility, but it's actually our delight. We've never found anybody that we've talked to about the LA 2024 plan that hasn't been incredibly enthusiastic. And there are things that we can do to help them. Their participation with us definitely helps us.
I agree, and I certainly share that enthusiasm. And just as we've got the significant venues already in place, you know, I think we have a tremendous reservoir of community support, involvement, interest that we want to engage as early as possible, as broadly as possible, as much as possible. And I think that the 84, LA 84 is a great model, and it's done some tremendous work over the years all over the city. And I hope we can build upon that, and I just want to make sure there's some funds there to do that.
Thanks.
Mr. O'Farrell.
Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. I just want to say a few words and ask a few questions. I think the methodology and the reporting, both from the LA 2024 Committee, KPMG, our own CAO, CLA, I think the involvement and collaboration has been outstanding and exceptional, and the report, I think, speaks to that as well. The great skill and care and thoughtfulness has gone into this report leading up to this MOU. And I'm in two minds here. You will find no larger fan or booster of the Olympic Games than myself. And Los Angeles is a city of optimists. I'm an optimist as well. But I think my job here is to be a realist, especially in the lead up to us making the bid. And I think that outside of this insular world where we're all so supportive and excited about landing the 2024 Olympic Games for Los Angeles, there's going to be a lot of skepticism out there. And I think we need to prepare for that, embrace for that, and really think about how we're going to speak to that. Because I think our bid is gaining great strength. Just the fact that we don't have to build any venues, I think we're in such good financial standing on the surface of things, and also being the number one market in the world for advertising and revenue, et cetera. The reason I talk about skepticism is because even in this report it states what we all know, and that is the last 10 Olympic Games, winter and summer, have run deficits, some enormous. And I don't have the information in terms of how the South Korean Winter Olympics are looking in 2018 in terms of budget, but we know that Tokyo is in trouble already for 2020, and there's lots of media about that. I'm not an oracle, but I have a sense that if we do this right, just like in 1984, in 2024, Los Angeles will save the Olympic movement if we get this right. Because I think the movement may be in trouble based on these cost overruns and the severe deficits. I think Sochi alone, the cost overrun was $50 billion. We're talking enormous numbers. Now, in Los Angeles, we know that the polling that was done, the overwhelming majority of Los Angelinos support the Olympics. And again, we're an optimistic city. But I think that same percentage would probably be flipped if they were asked, okay, would you be willing to pay for cost overruns? Or if we run into a deficit, would you be willing to pay for that? So I think it's up to us to just do all we can to address that very real concern. I'm optimistic by what I've heard, everything I've heard so far in this process, that we're going to deliver a profitable games. However, we have to, I think, probe further and explore the possibilities so that we don't suffer in that worst case scenario, or even a scenario that's not great, and that is we're on the hook for $250 million. So what I'd like to hear is if you could describe the range of insurance policies that are under consideration within the MOU vis-a-vis including the city of Los Angeles. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? I know we talked about it before, but if you could give us a sense of what might be coming.
I'd be happy to do that. Maybe Miguel or Sharon would have additional information to share with you, but the OCOG, the organizing committee, will obtain and maintain at our own costs a comprehensive set of insurance policies to limit liability exposures prior to and during the games, and the potential for lost revenue should the games be disrupted or canceled. The categories we're committed to obtaining include event cancellation, trade credit, that's if the sponsor fails to satisfy its payment obligation, loss of appeal, so that we would lose ticket or other revenues and they'd fail to achieve our projections if the events become less appealing to consumers, common risks associated with large sporting events, for example, terrorism, injured visitors, property damage, as well as risks specific to LA, for example, earthquake or wildfire. Cyber insurance to cover, for example, loss related to broadcast interruptions, interference with scoring or tracking of events, interference with ticket sales, etc. And an overarching excess policy that provides a very significant umbrella amount above and beyond the limits of the other policies. The organizing committee shall provide copies of all purchased insurance policies to the city.
And if I could add, the MOUs, the MOU itself, which is not before you now, we're still negotiating it, will ensure that all of those mitigations are included as part of not only our relationship with the committee, but also other jurisdictions' relationship with the committee, because the committee is really sort of the conduit that protects the city. So to the extent that there's events in other cities and other venues outside of the city, we want to make sure that that level of protection exists in those circumstances as well.
All right. And so to that end, in terms of, again, the International Olympic Committee requirement that the host city accommodate any cost overruns to $250 million, would that kick in after all insurance claims are exhausted? Is that accurate?
Yes.
That would kick in at that point.
That is correct. And so the MOU will specify that.
Okay, and then to Mr. Blumenfield's point, it's still not entirely clear to me, but we know that the state wouldn't kick anything in until we then paid the cost overrun, should that happen. And again, I preface to say, in the extremely unlikely event, but I just think it's something we have to keep noodling to see what kind of protection we can give taxpayers. And again, outside of this room, a potentially very skeptical public. But I think we have a strong case to make because for all the facts that have been communicated today and previously. So I would love to see my concerns manifested in the MOU and in the continuing conversations. Thank you.
Mr. Cedillo.
Question's a little different than budget, but kind of impact on the budgets, the proposals here. So we're counting on infrastructure in place. And my questions are, to what extent are we engaged in agencies like Metro, with LAX, et cetera, to make sure that the infrastructure and the committed investments that are going to take place regardless are on schedule? And what are the things that both the city can do to make sure that those projections, say for certain stops in the Inland Empire or for, ingress, egress at the LAX and moving people, that those are on schedule in place and get in front of the queue with respect to other long-term projects that are both part of Measure M and LAX?
So if I can respond to that, one way of addressing that is to note that in the MOU, one term that we have agreed and we're actually quite enthusiastic about is that the city would have significant representation on the board of the organizing committee, which both allows the city to have oversight, direct oversight and involvement, but also allows the organizing committee to use the city and to have the city help when it comes to issues like that. We view this very much as a partnership with the city and with all other elements of Southern California government that might be called into play because of things that you suggest. So that is our commitment and our obligation, but from the beginning, we want to have direct engagement with those authorities.
And let me raise two concerns. To what extent do we have the capacity, are we projected on the hotel capacity, the Airbnb, the hosting for the games, and what can we do to make sure, right, that we're enabling builders, developers to make sure that we have the full capacity?
Well, thank you for the question. I'll give you an update on where we are. We have a commitment to the IOC. This is part of our plan that we will establish that there will be 40,000 rooms available during the period of the games. So we actually are negotiating right now with hotel operators to have them make commitments to us for the time during the games, during the summer of 2024. Those rooms would be available at a rate which is a market rate, so that they can, if you will, increase the prices because of the demand for the games. And that's a process that we're in the middle of working with. So far, we're well over 20,000 rooms, and so it's been a very constructive process. I've met myself with the Travel and Convention Bureau and managers of hotels, and it's an ongoing process. We want them to understand that for their purposes, making this commitment to us has to be good for them as well. Now, anything that you can do if you have relationships with hotel operators to reinforce the community's need to be able to demonstrate this would be helpful to us. We want to make the argument that relative to Paris, for example, the inventory and quality of hotel accommodations in Los Angeles is superb. And I think we actually can make that argument and prove it, but we're in the process of putting the facts together that support that.
The city's engaged in this discussion about hosting and Airbnb, et cetera. What's the numbers or percent we would anticipate that plays into those 40,000 keys?
The question is, what's the percentage of rooms available that would...
or that we would anticipate or project?
Well, I believe I've seen numbers that are well over 100,000 rooms in the area, so we're talking about a manageable amount of inventory that would be committed to us, not something that would take the market, if you will, out of the opportunity to provide accommodations to other travel and visitors who would come to Southern California. We've had several presentations to the community that supports us, all of the convention, travel, and people who are in these markets, and they're as enthusiastic as everybody else is about the prospect of the games.
And I think it's important to point out that should the city be fortunate to host the games, the market would react to that. I think there would be a response to try to help continue to build the capacity of hotels, as we've already seen over the last decade, particularly in downtown Hollywood and the West Side. And certainly as your council debates and determines what kind of policies to establish related to shared housing, such as Airbnb and other programs like that, that would certainly determine to what extent the number of guests that come to Los Angeles will be using those opportunities.
Mr. Cedillo, I might add about the LAX. LAWA has retained outside counselor experts in flies.
Speaking of hosting,
Maybe someone sued the city about the fly. Give us more work. We've been working closely with the outside law firm on their contracting and are monitoring that from a legal point of view, but also from a practical point of view. And the lawyers who've done a lot of project work, a lot of project finance, and I want to go into the details now, although I could some other time, they put a lot of safeguards in there, and they believe, although 2024 is the target for completing all the work at LAX, that they think it can be done by 2022. So we are involved in that and watching it.
Mr. President, I want to dominate one last of the
Go ahead.
last two concerns. The other concerns are along the lines of concerns raised by Mr. Price. People are just entered the room and they're here because we're going to be involved in a big endeavor, $3.5 billion deal we're putting together for 10 years, $7 billion for 20. One of the areas that we didn't perform well in is integrating small businesses. And part of it wasn't done at the beginning, and we've tried to rally in the last hours to see that small business benefits and is integrated into the project. I'd like to hear that you guys are thinking about small business and its role in this, its role in because part of the excitement is that there's also going to be a big boost to our local economy, that venues in the Inland Empire and Pasadena and San Diego, Orange County, Ventura County, that these smaller events are actually, though, big for some of these local communities and provide opportunities for small businesses, but they have to be given notice and opportunity at the beginning so that they can participate.
We agree with you, and that is actually part of our plan. We haven't included anything in the budget that reflects that, but I'd be happy to come back and talk with you in greater detail about that. It is our intention, and we're happy to communicate our interest and enthusiasm to make specific commitments to involve small business operators throughout Los Angeles and, frankly, throughout the entire community to the extent we work beyond the city as well.
Thank you. I'm good.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to reiterate Mr. Cedillo's point and concern. And as we move through this process, I'd love to see plans for outreach and to make sure that we have diverse participation and that we have participation from a lot of your quote-unquote small businesses. This is, you don't have this opportunity all of the time, and you don't want to blow it. And Mr. Cedillo is absolutely correct. This is something that we have to begin at the beginning. We have to start this conversation at the beginning. In fact, Gilbert, we probably should have talked about this going all the way back to our first meeting, but I'm glad you brought it up now. So, but again, know that it's going to be very important to all of us. So with that, I want to go back to Mr. Krikorian.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just to follow up on one of the points that Mr. Buscaino raised about other city services and the costs involved in those, it seems to me that probably the most significant of those will be police services. And there's always a bit of a tension involving reimbursement of police services for really special events and things, sporting events in particular. That's been a big part of our discussion. So have we started to have that dialogue yet with regard to the reimbursement of those costs? Has anybody started to put pen to paper and figuring out what those costs may be?
So we have made, I think, informed estimates of those costs and included them in our budget. So we've budgeted for municipal services that are above and beyond normal and customary services. These include enhanced local public safety services, so overtime for police, fire, and emergency medical services, road closures, street services, field of play modifications for road events, for example, enhanced city department services, which would include monitoring and coordinating the games effort across all city departments, and enhanced sanitation and cleaning services.
Great.
So that is definitely built into this budget that you're seeing today.
Great. And then, Mr. Santana, maybe I can't count on you for this now for the coming budget, but in past budgets, we actually, for the fire department, for example, we added positions who were dedicated to planning for the Special Olympics over the course of about 2 years, as I recall. So I think we need to look at whether or not those kind of positions are going to be necessary for our larger departments, police, fire, EMD, the others, that are going to play a key role here. So to your team, you might want to noodle on that a little bit. In terms of the major infrastructure projects, this was one of the concerns that Mr. Cedillo just raised and that KPMG also raised about the need to track these things because of the dramatic impact they could have on the balance sheet, one way or the other. And it's one of our biggest selling points. In order to ensure it's one of our biggest selling points, we need to make sure that we track this. The one thing with the transportation projects, Mr. Cedillo, is that you have the mayor and myself sitting on the Metro board. It's needless to say, an enormous priority because of the Olympics to ensure that they stay on track. But I think, Gene, to your point on governance, I think we're all going to expect to see robust city engagement in the executive committee, in the audit and finance committee, and others going forward, so that we can ensure that we're on top of that. And I think related to that is the issue of venue changes, because completing the infrastructure is one thing, but we have sort of baked into this proposal, as we discussed last time, the ability to have some redundancy in venues so that we can move events around without engaging in additional costs. That's a good thing, but it also has a very real impact on potentially on the cost side, but also, to Mr. Buscaino's earlier point, on the secondary benefits to the city, tax revenues notably among them. So if there's any discussion, if anybody, for example, ever lets the thought start to creep into their head that the opening ceremonies or the closing ceremonies of this game will take place anywhere other than the city of Los Angeles, for example, if anybody gets it in mind that it might move to Inglewood or some other place, that's going to be a very important factor for this city council to take into account, for example. So I guess I need to reiterate KPMG's point about monitoring this, but also on the governance side, I just think it's essential that, if there's going to be any significant venue changes like that, that changes the value equation for us. It really does. Maybe not if it's badminton at the Galen Center. I don't want to keep raising that example, but major venue changes will be important to this council. And I think as we go forward, we have to continue to have some voice in that discussion.
Mr. Krikorian, we'll get into the MOU at the next meeting, but our team is working very closely with LA 24 to conclude those negotiations. Our expectation is to have that completed this month and present it before your council. The issue of venue changes is one of the issues that we're talking about. To what extent will there be flexibility to make changes after the submission? What role will the city have in determining whether those changes outside of the city would be acceptable? What kind of process would be taking place to ensure that your council and the mayor are informed of those changes and have a role and a say? As Mr. Seitz indicated, the city will have representation on the committee, so there would be a role, but one of the issues we're still discussing is beyond that, what other additional safeguards will the city have in light of the fact of the guarantee that's been established?
Yeah, and just to be clear, it's not just it's a governance question. It's a budget question.
Correct.
Because, what this does on the revenue side, what it does on the expense side, and what it does on the secondary benefit side for the city it's a dollars and cents issue. For example, if we should decide to, I don't know, move the opening ceremony to the Fairplex in Pomona or something, I would think that would be something that would not be in the interest of this city to do. All right. Thank you very. Oh, and Gene, I'm very impressed by the insurance package. Did KPMG review the levels of insurance in that?
Yes, we did look at the insurance. We looked at the budget for the premiums for the insurance as part of our budget review.
Okay.
We had no concerns.
Great. I had no idea that there was insurance for loss of appeal. If only we could all have such insurance. Wouldn't it be a better world? Thank you, Mr. Wesson.
Thank you, and members, be assured I would hope at the next meeting we'd be able to have a detailed conversation where it relates to the MOU, the possible changes, or what have you.
That's
But
our intention.
I want to recognize Mr. Buscaino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One last question as it relates to the budget. We're in a competition here, and we have two competitors, Budapest and Paris, and we do everything we can to beat our two competitors like the Olympic Games. So how does this budget before us compare maybe to the budget being proposed? I know we don't know the details, but just optically, how does our budget compare to the budget that's going to be proposed by Budapest and Paris?
So we have one budget which covers everything that we're going to do. Almost every other city that hosts the Olympic Games or bids to host the Olympic Games has two budgets. One budget for operating the games and one budget for infrastructure that they're building. Since so much of the infrastructure is purpose-built for the Olympics, a stadium, for example, or an Olympic village. That second budget is often it is often less than transparent, because there could be private money associated with public money in a partnership, for example. That's what London had. They had a budget for their Olympic Village, but the budgetary authority for the Olympic Village had to be completely reorganized before they actually hosted the games. So the direct comparison has some difficulty because of that. Both Budapest and London submitted budgetary information in the last submission, in the stage 2 submission, and we've seen that, but we have not seen really final budgets. We don't believe, and KPMG may speak to this, that bid cities commonly do the amount of very extensive work that we've done with real operators, with facilities that exist and operate today the way that we have. So we believe our budget is substantially more detailed. And in fact, the IOC hasn't, if you will, admitted that to us yet, but I think the feedback has been pretty positive. But it is different than what they're used to seeing because it's a singular budget. So what we have is a very strong budget and a very strong budget presentation. It's different than they're used to seeing. And so we have to be very clear and we have to communicate effectively for them to understand that and give us credit for what we have. There is a great temptation, really, on the part of the IOC staff to make everyone look the same, so that they would end up with something that would say Budapest is as strong as Los Angeles or Paris is as strong as Los Angeles. Now, I will tell you that's ridiculous, but our job is to make it so ridiculous that they can't get away with saying that. So our attempt at every move is to make our bid as strong as possible, as clear as possible, have the budget reflect that, but the bid itself has to be incredibly compelling. That's our goal, and we see the city as our most important partner in that goal.
Well, clearly, the budget being proposed, we're going to see some profitable games here if we land the Olympic Games in 2024. That's what the IOC is looking for. So I believe you're continuing to put together a competitive package that's going to bring revenues and, Mr. Krikorian said, put the Olympic Games back on the map as it should here in Los Angeles. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Krikorian.
Sorry, Mr. President.
No problem.
One other thing. We were talking earlier about some of the built-in contingencies in this, which is great. And there's contingencies on contingencies, which is also great. But since the city is kind of on the back-end guarantor of this, can you, I don't know, Mr. Santana, maybe you can talk a little bit about how the application of the contingencies applies to our risk level on the back end. So on all these contingencies, whether the construction contingency, design contingencies, the overall game contingencies, when do those get applied and when do they put at risk our commitment at the back end?
Well, I think it's important to think about the contingencies as having different components. So to the extent that there's any actual work that's being done, there's specific contingencies to that. The issue of the contingency and how it applies to the overall budget is still one of the issues that we're negotiating in the context of the MOU. The city's position is that we see it as separate and apart from the budget in the same way that we see sort of our reserve. As a city, we have a reserve that we protect that carries over year after year. And that when we actually review the budget on an ongoing basis, that we look at everything, the expenditures and the revenues, with the assumption that the contingency is going to stay intact. So regardless of what occurs year after year up to the games, we have that protection, and that cushion isn't being sort of considered as part of the changes that occur in the budget as we get closer. And so we expect that in the context of the MOU, when we're back here, we will provide greater clarity as to how that applies. Sharon, I don't know if you want to add something.
The contingency, you can view it almost as the city's first line of defense and any financial liability. So, of course, we're going to be very concerned about the use of it. There is no surplus as we sit here today because, we don't know what the final costs are. But the contingency will be what protects the city. It's the cushion. It's kind of akin to the reserve fund for the city of LA. It sits outside of the budget, but as the reserve fund for our city budget, there is extra scrutiny in terms of how that reserve fund is used and how we try to maintain that reserve fund and use it only in very, very limited and extreme circumstances.
Well, and if I may, to that point, whenever we dip into our reserve fund in our budget, that is something that the council directs. So I just want to make sure that before we were to do that with this budget, that there would be an opportunity for the city to be able to weigh in, because it directly puts at risk $250 million of potential liability, and then some. So we need to have some check-in of some kind, as you're discussing this with the MOU, some role that the city would have in determining when and how and to what extent those contingencies are applied.
And that's how we're actually approaching it in the same, thinking about it in the way we manage the city's budget, as Sharon indicated. So the review process, I don't anticipate it to be a month-long season as certainly as we engage in. But, as Gene indicated, the goal here is not to have any surprises. And so if we treat the contingency, or sort of in our thinking, the reserve, as a given, that regardless of where expenditures and revenues are, that will stay intact and be protected, then we actually get a sense of the real sort of changes that are occurring year after year. So if in fact there is an increase in construction cost or an increase in labor cost or a need to change a venue or suddenly there's an event outside of our control that impacts revenue, both the committee and the city can respond to that and forecast it into the future, right, in the same way that we forecast our own budget.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, and last thing I want to say is, the three of you have been a great team, Sharon, Big Jim, Miguel. You've worked very well with LA 2024. Where it relates to the timing of the MOU, if you could do everything within your power, Miguel, to make sure that this thing is wrapped up before we have to augment this team, because it's been a very successful team. So that's that's important. Okay, are there any? Okay, I want to thank everybody. Well, Madam Clerk, you're looking at me. You want to say something?
What is your recommendation for the report before us? The committee's recommendation?
What do you think? I'll do whatever you recommend.
Would you like to continue it in committee?
I think that's a good idea, and then we'll discuss it when we come back after the new year. Anyway, thank you all. I thought this was a great conversation. I think we put a lot out there that people can noodle on. So this committee's adjourned. Thank you.